Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Christy Vogler.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Colin McCormick.
And today we have a very special episode discussing The Return, a 2024 drama retelling of the last sections of Homer's Odyssey. It's more like the last 11 books of the Odyssey, as adapted by Edward Bond, John Cawley, and Uberto Pasolini. The film is directed by Pasolini and stars Ralph Fiennes, Juliette Binoche, and Charlie Plummer. But today it's not going to be our usual group discussion. Instead, we have in one of our largest groups for an episode ever. We are joined by a panel of guests for our very first reception battle episode because we're not all in agreement over if we dig this or not. Two of the guests are some familiar friends of the pod. We have Joel Christensen, professor of classical studies at Brandeis University, Amy Pistone, now officially associate professor of classical civilizations at Gonzaga University. Woo!
We'll put in air horns.
Yeah, air horns for sure. And we have one brand new guest to our podcast that we're really excited to introduce. So we have Joe Goodkin, a Chicago-based musician and modern bard who composed two modern folk opera retellings of Homer's epic poems, The Odyssey and the Iliad, known as the Blues of Achilles. So warm welcome to Joe as well.
So happy to be here.
And usually we do a plot summary of the movie. We'll get into particular parts of it. But honestly, at this point, you should just read the book because Christopher Nolan is going to do a movie of this next year. And you're going to want to read it at that point anyway. So just go read the book. Enough said for the plot. We are going to ask all our guests, what's your personal history with Homeric epic, your personal interest in it, and a very brief and quick, do you dig this movie? And then we will unpack all of our feelings and emotions about it. So let us begin with our brand new guest, Joe Goodkin.
Absolutely. So I have an undergraduate degree in classics from Wisconsin-Madison, where I encountered the Odyssey and the Iliad in Greek and in reception and translation. And for the last 20 years, I've been going around the country and the world performing epic. I call it sort of a experiment in living reception. I'm a reception merchant. And I've brought these two folk operas to audiences in all 50 states and also around the world in Greece and Italy. So that's my connection to it. I feel like I've actually lived both the experience of presenting reception and also a little bit of the experience of what Odysseus goes through. And it's enlightened me as to this connection between the bard and his or her subject in the retelling. And I will say that I dig the movie. Yes, I dig it.
Awesome. All right. How about Joel? Can you go ahead and tell us about your background and
sure.
whether or not you dig it?
Anybody who's heard me on this podcast before knows it's a dangerous thing to ask about my relationship with Homer. So I'll put it simply this way. I used to not like Homer, and then I read Homer in ancient Greek, and I fell in love, and I spent years trying to figure out why I fell in love. And that's turned into 25 years of a career just working on Homer. The more bedeviling thing is my relationship with the Odyssey. As I've mentioned before, in Homeric studies, you tend to either be an Iliad man or an Odyssey person. And it usually tends to follow those gendered lines. And I spent the first 10 years of my career really as an Iliad man, a lot because I lived in New York after 9/11, World of War, it made sense. But the irony is I always found I was better at teaching the Odyssey than I was at the Iliad. So I spent about a decade researching the Odyssey and modern psychology, and I wrote a book about it, and I thought I was done. But then I got asked to edit a 24-essay volume on the Odyssey that is almost finished, and then I thought I was done. But every moment, every chance I get, the Odyssey pulls me back in, and this movie happened, and then I fell in love with Epic the Musical, which I'm going to mention at least 5 times tonight.
Yes.
And then stupid Nolan decided he was going to make a movie about the Odyssey. And so I am now a thrall to the Odyssey.
Don't you love when art imitates life? It's almost like you angered some god and then just
Seriously, who did I piss off? So I took my 13-year-old son to see this movie. Mm-hmm. And it was the first movie I saw in the theater since COVID. And I really, really wanted to dig it. And I almost did. But then it me up.
All right.
You fell into the trench that you were trying to dig. We got
on.
it.
That's where I am. I'm going to ratchet it down. Deep breaths.
Amy, bring us back down.
Yeah. So first of all, I would love to reconvene this panel after the Christopher Nolan movie version. We can like revisit this conversation there, because I
100%.
imagine
for sure.
we will all have strong opinions about that as well. But I am a Hellenist, but I'm not a Homerist. I knew very early on in grad school I didn't want to work on Homer because people are in strong camps. And I was like, I don't know what I think. Like, I don't want to be in a camp of, is there a Homer? Are there many? Are we all Homer in a sense? Like, so as tragedy is so much Homeric reception. And so, I think of Homer largely as a text of myriad receptions all over the place. Also, I teach Homer a lot, and I am an Odyssey person. Over the years, I have come much more to appreciate things about the Iliad, but I am still very much sort of an Odyssey person. And I dug it. I am only on this podcast because I got in a fight with Joel about how I liked it, and I didn't entirely agree with. I'm not going to say I didn't like his review, but I didn't entirely agree with his view on Blue Sky. And now I'm here to hash it out with my strongly held beliefs that Joel is wrong. I don't know what he's going to say yet, but I think he's wrong.
Can I clarify really quick that I think my job here is going to be like Derek Smalls and Spinal Tap, to be lukewarm water. I'm going to be... That's my job.
Joel just taking it to 11 over here.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right. I think I want to hear from Colin next, because Colin withheld many comments when I was gushing about the movie originally.
That's the Odyssean trick I pulled on you, because I actually don't have many comments on it. Part of it is it was limited release, and I hunted around, and then I did poor planning, and by the time I was ready to see it, it was not available in any theaters near me. So I drove about an hour and 20 minutes each way to Norwich, Connecticut, to find a theater. I was the only person in the theater for like a 9:40 showing. And I got back at like 1:30 in the morning, having watched the movie and just digested it. And at the end of the day, I was just kind of like, neither here nor like, it was fine. I thought it was competently made. It was very pared down, which was a choice, and in some ways felt, I don't know, like it was a very, maybe not middle of the road, but it felt like a very kind of staid version of the Odyssey. And so, yeah, I actually just kind of am like, I don't know. I'm sort of, maybe I was just too tired and critical thought left my brain when I saw it, but I was just kind of like, it was fun.
And the masses now want to know, are you an Iliad man or an Odyssey girl?
I'm firmly in the Odyssey camp, and I think I always have been. I agree, I think both with Joel and Amy, that the Odyssey is easier to teach. The Iliad comes with extra baggage that you need to explain why everybody is kind of, not that they aren't being like child men, but like you have to explain a little extra hard that there is a kind of rationale to why everybody is acting this way and just like what's going on. Whereas the Odyssey, I think, has a little bit more like translatability. And I'm sure we're going to get into this, but also like, I think it's testament to the fact that the Odyssey, I'm wondering like if you were to like line it all up in terms of like receptions, adaptations, references, like the Odyssey might be the most adapted piece of fiction, we'll say. I would argue. The fact that it's a word, like how many other books like became a word, right? We don't say like, I'm having a Moby Dick, right? Or something like that.
It means something very different if you do.
Are we going to get to that part of the movie though?
Shame there. Colin, a few years back, I had students did like the Google Ngram or whatever stuff with it, and found that there was prior to about 1920 or so, references in literature to the Iliad far outweighed the Odyssey, but the Odyssey started to shoot up and has been dominant for 100 years now. So there may be something particularly modern about it. I don't want to blame it all on James Joyce or credit him that much, but something changed.
Yeah.
I think my unvetted and unresearched is, I'm going to say World War I is what did it, and just killed war for everybody.
I do think the change, like our changing relationship to war in terms of the distance at which we can keep ourselves, like our war is much more away from, like, for a modern American audience, at least, like, it's something you can hold at arm's length. Like, you might know people who serve in the military, but it's not the same as how Europe was, like, ravaged by World War II, and people who are like currently in war-torn countries. And I think, like, at least for an American audience, I think that has to be something of the difference. But I don't know. I remember reading something a while back about how the Odyssey as a work is kind of like Odysseus as a character, that it's very adaptable. And it, like, war is kind of one thing, right? I mean, I guess you could make it a metaphor for other things, but it's kind of like it's about war. And the Odyssey is a very malleable and slippery and adaptable text. Do we trust our narrator? Is there an unreliable narrator? Is Odysseus, like, because it's so twisty turny, like, I think that must have something to do with why, and kind of, especially like a postmodern context, like, it's something that really appeals a lot, because it's not straightforward, right? It is. I think that appeals a lot to our modern sensibilities.
I agree. I was just going to say, I think that it's a lot harder post Civil War and repeating firearms to flirt with the idea that war is glorious and it's chivalrous or any of that stuff. There's no honor, right? And the people who think this are those who don't send their sons to war.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right,
Eli?
Lash. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I have been solidly an Iliad girly since the beginning, so I'm an outlier here. I was looking around just like my bookshelves earlier today. I was like, where's my copy of the Odyssey? I realized I don't have a hard copy, but I have 3 copies of the Iliad. So that's like where my brain is. I'm also not a Hellenist. I'm also not a philologist even. I am an archaeologist. And so I feel like I enjoy the literary aspects of this on a more, I would like, surface level. I like a good war story, and I really like the Iliad, and it's been one of my favorites. I had to read the Odyssey in high school. I think it's like the first thing they made us read in freshman English. And I'm like, maybe I just don't like it because they told me I had to. But I have grown to like have a much deeper appreciation for the Odyssey after reading some of it in Greek, after, you know, thinking about Odysseus as a character. And I really dig this movie as a classicist. I feel like this was a really interesting take. And I don't dig this movie as like a film watcher. It was very boring. And I don't know if Schliemann has anything to do with my love of the Iliad. Thank you.
Amy's like blowing up our DMs right now.
Yeah. I think that
For
is part of it,
listeners
though.
at
I
home.
think there is like something that archaeologists take away from the Iliad, of like going and like looking for the physical anachronisms described in the poem and the locations. So
Yeah. I did go to the site of Troy as an undergrad with the man who is now my husband. So that obviously had a huge impact on me as a baby archaeologist and as a baby classicist. So,
Chrissy, that leaves you.
yeah, I'm actually the same as Leish. I actually really like the Iliad more than the Odyssey, although, as the crew knows, my earliest memory of Introduction to Greek Mythology is Wishbone shooting the bow and arrow through the 12 axes.
literally thought about that.
I can
And
remember
the
that.
food fight that they have.
Yes.
So like the Odyssey is my introduction, as far as I remember, into classical mythology as a whole. And like I literally am watching the scene of Wishbone playing in my head at the same time I'm watching Ray Fiennes just pull the bow back and get ready.
I want a supercut of like every possible way the axes have been positioned and reimagined. Like which part of the
So
axe does the
different.
arrow go? Does it go through the handle? Does it go through like the head?
I
Does it go
liked the
through
interpretation of this one a lot.
Same.
Like,
I
it
did too.
never
satisfied
seen
the
it.
archaeologist in me
This
so much.
was the correct interpretation.
Yeah.
I actually think
I
the bow
agree.
scene was perfect.
Pretty awesome. Yeah.
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 Yeah. But otherwise, I too like the Iliad, and I was teaching it as part of like a World Survey course. And the theme for it was actually looking at mass killing events to look for patterns over time of what happens in mass killing events, what kind of rhetoric is used to allow them to happen and everything like that. And I like starting with the Iliad because it's like, okay, our source for this is a poem written hundreds of years after the fact, but it introduces the concept of oral storytelling as history and how you can't discount that as a source. And you can use other things like archaeology and physical evidence to help get at the truth of some of that history. And then you go into Cortez, who writes about the Spanish conquest firsthand as it's happening. But he's also on the run from Spanish law at the same time, and he's grounded his ship, so his men have no option but to follow him and go and conquer central Mexico. And it's a really interesting comparison of like, who do we trust as a source then? This guy who was there at the time things happened, but he has a motive, or Homer, who is just recounting these tales of wars over and over a long period of time, and it's just been accrued. And I say Homer in the very, let's not get into the Homer argument, but just as an oral history, a way of remembering the past. And so I've always really liked the Iliad. And I think the reason I love this movie is because to me, the Odyssey was always focused on the adventure part of it, like the coming back home. And this was very much dealing with what I wanted dealt with, is like the realities, not just of warfare, but like what happens after the war.
Mm-hmm.
And this pared down version of it made me want to go back and read the Odyssey. It's like, how was it embellished in the, like, I haven't wanted to go and read the Odyssey again in a very long time. And this movie made me want to do that. So for that, I definitely dig this movie. I really do. And because it made me want to go back to the source material and examine it again and think about it. So that's where I'm at the moment. And I know we have all a lot more to say about it. So
Can I ask just a quick follow-up question for you? Because like Elijah mentioned, like in digging it as a classicist, not as a film watcher, like I'm hearing some of that same energy of like as a class, it makes you want to go back to the source material. Did you dig it in its own right? Or did you dig it because of how it made you think about the source material and that's it?
Okay, that's a great question. And I will go into one of the points I brought up that seemed like a very film thing. I loved the slow pace, the minimal like approach to this, the like not an overuse of soundtrack, a lot of natural sound. And I loved seeing it in the theater because I was surrounded by it. And this was shot in Corfu. And like I felt like being back in Sicily or being back in the Mediterranean, like, and it feels slow, but it's like that is the pace of life at that time, right? That is the Bronze Age. There's not a lot of people. There's not a lot going on, but like every little story matters in that moment. Of every little thing that happens to each person. What happens to the swineherd? What happens to the goat herd? And everything is going to be a big deal. It's going to be an epic tale. But like when you see it in its reality, it's so much slower. And the reason I think I found it such a breath of fresh air after Megalopolis in theaters, Gladiator in theaters, and even Wicked in theaters, which is colorful and fast-paced and musical.
And also half a story.
Yes.
Yeah.
But my favorite moment of Wicked was that quiet moment at the dance where basically Ifalba and Galinda reconcile, not with words, but like quiet, small actions. And like, it felt like the theater was holding its breath in that moment. No one's talking. It's just a moment of connection. And I forgot like how much I missed, or how much like our media is so desperate to keep our attention with bright flashing lights and action and witty dialogue like Gilmore Girls and things like that, that like to see something slow for once was a huge relief. And I really actually enjoyed it. So that's from the filmography side. I also enjoyed it for that reason.
I think that's a cool question though, Amy, because I think the first time I watched it in the theater, I was watching with my classics brain and my bard brain, like, and I was measuring it against the version I wanted to see of the Odyssey. And so I had an uneasy dig the first watch. Like I dug it kind of uneasily, but I watched it last night for the movie that was actually made. So less classics brain, less bard brain. And I liked it a lot more. Like I thought there's a real, like if I came to it without this baggage of what I was expecting to see, I thought it was really powerful. So maybe that's like a discussion for everybody as we get into it for multiple watches. If you're able to, I mean, I guess that goes to the question of when you know a lot about it and it is a reception, what, you know, it's your own baggage basically at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe Deserves a rewatch. Yeah.
Yeah, any fandom, right, of any time there's an adaptation from book to movie or whatever, from X to Y, right? There's always the kind of tension between like the film or the text, we'll say, like as we are presented, and the text we wished we wanted or we wanted it to be. And like there's always that conundrum. And like, yeah, sometimes, because you can say like, oh, I think this is not trying to be like its source, or it's deliberate, it understands it but is doing it different. Or then there are cases where like it's trying to be air quotes faithful in, you know, some way, whether to the spirit or to the letter, but you know, it misses the mark. And then that's where we come in, I guess.
So here's the thing. I want to start out by saying that when I hear you guys talk about the movie, so much of me agrees with you. So I went in it and like the starkness of it, the spareness, just focusing on Odysseus, every step along the way are actually decisions I was rooting for and I loved. Right. And so I think going against the spectacle bullshit, going like really trying to make it spare was great. Right. But and I was rooting for the movie to be good. I really was trying hard not to be that guy I always am. But then I think where it fell apart for me, or started to fall apart, is the movie tried to be a reception of the Odyssey that was stark and modern and psychologically severe. But then it just exposed fundamental misunderstandings of the Odyssey that undermined everything else for me. And so I'll pick like 3 scenes that will be spoilers, but 3 of them indicate to me how they fundamentally don't get what's going on. First, the dog, right? Argos.
Hold on a second. Go ahead.
Let me just do the 3, Joe. Do the like the moment
Let him
of
have
Argos
his moment,
in the
then we
Odyssey,
can fight him.
But it's something people always remember. It touches their hearts. They get upset about this dog, and I always feel like shit, because my question is, why do you feel feelings for the dog but not the suitors or the handmaidens? But that's my problem. But the important thing in the Odyssey is that the dog smells Odysseus through his disguise. It indicates that he is something solid and real beneath the disguise. But in the movie, the dog's lying there, and it like whispers Argos, and then the dog notices and dies.
I watched this. I did the Zapruder phone with this last night. So hold on a second. So that may be the triggering incident. I'm sorry to completely jump in like this, but
this is what
please do. Yeah,
the dog was also smelling him. You could see it. He was wrinkling his nose.
I will let people go and find the grassy knoll themselves, and I'll go to number 2. Number 2, Laertes. All right. Laertes dies, and they have a burial, and like Odysseus goes. And this isn't just second time now I'll mention Epic the Musical, which just released its final saga, and it's wonderful. Mm-hmm. But everyone in modernity thinks the Odyssey is about Odysseus and Penelope. Odyssey is about Odysseus returning to his former self. And if you don't have his reunion with his father and his people, you don't have the Odyssey. You have a romance. And that's what you want. It's fine. But like, I just like, why did they do that? Why even make that choice? Leave Laertes out. Why float him there just to kill him? Like, it shows that like it just undermines the narrative for me, but that's my problem.
Well, right. Joel, just to jump in, because Joel, like you're bringing in kind of a hot philological issue, because Laertes' big thing is in Odyssey 24, which we don't need to get into, but it's included.
But it is like there's so to give the movie their due, which is fair. There's a tradition that goes back to Aristophanes of Byzantium, a Hellenistic editor who thought the Odyssey should end at book 23, line 396 or 296, when Odysseus and Penelope finally get jiggy with it again. But that again, just because you are signing on to historical misunderstanding doesn't make it right? Like the book 24 of the Odyssey is critical, and this is why Epic the Musical broke my heart last month when it let out the final saga, because if they're not going to do book 24, it's not the Odyssey. It's something different. It's Aristophanes of Byzantium's Odyssey, and I don't want that. All right, final thing, and I'm talking too much. Look, one of the most amazing things about the Odyssey, and I think a really strong part of the movie up until the moment that killed me, was the inscrutability of Penelope. What does she want? What's she really thinking? When does she know it's Odysseus? All right. That makes the Odyssey, listening to it or reading it, amazing. And it makes her so complicated. Right. But in this movie, and sorry for spoiler, guys, like when Telemachus is messing with the bow and getting as close to Oedipus as humanly possible, she tells him to give the bow to your father. Like, why? I probably would have walked out of that theater 100% happier if not for that one stupid line. And I fear, and this is the last thing I'll say for a bit, I fear they did it because they thought people are too stupid and they wanted to reduce the ambiguity. Joe, you're shaking your head. I may be wrong again. But that thing, it killed the ambiguity, the uncertainty. Right. It made her part of the plan, and it flattened her character in a way that betrayed the actress's excellence throughout the movie. Out.
Mic drop.
All right.
Joe, take it away. But I've been taking notes. I got so fired up. I was like, finding
Yeah.
shit to write
Hold on.
down.
I have thoughts on the Larities.
Hold on a second.
Too.
Amy, why don't you go? I got to scream about the dog smelling, so go ahead, Amy.
To quote Kanye, don't let him get into his zone.
Right.
I have a thought on the Larities thing and why it makes sense to me in a modern retelling. And the reason is, otherwise, a modern audience could not understand how Penelope has been able to maintain control of this island without Odysseus being there. And Telemachus not being able to take over. You have Larities present, right? In the sense that, like, oh, technically there's still an old king here in charge. And then you have him die as the catalyst for putting things into motion. And I think Epic the Musical prompted, like, she decided to come up with the challenge because she saw a storm on the horizon that was out of season or something. So she took that as the sign, like, oh, I should break out the bow and arrow and do the challenge.
But like, I just imagine a reunion song between Laertes and Odysseus.
I agree. And I think that goes to Argus too, right? A lot of this isn't just the story of, like, I think about the joy he realizes when he's on Ithaca and he goes out and he, like, consumes the soil. He's just so, like, almost can't believe he's home and is so happy he's finally made it there, but then is also dealing with maybe the guilt of, like, all that time wasted, especially if you get the sense you don't get an answer. Why did it take him so long to come back, other than he was afraid to come back? He was afraid to come back after what he had lived through. And that fear that held him back means he has lost time with so many things that he actually cared about. So, like, to me, that was kind of the overall message. The Larities dying fed into that as well. And it was just another reason. It's like, how do we know a Greek person is dead? You put coins on his eyes. And
Can I offer a simple explanation for that line you're talking about, which I didn't like the first time, but I thought about this last night, which was, she thinks that Telemachus doesn't know it's his dad. She doesn't know that he knows. So she just has to tell him, give up the bow. This is okay.
Or, like, doesn't accept or something.
Yeah. That's like, and I had all the same problems with you with that line where I was like, come on, like, what are we doing here? You know? But, like, then I thought, I'm like, she doesn't know that Telemachus knows that's Odysseus. She has no idea, right? Maybe it's a simple, like, that's what she has to do to get him to give up the bow, is like, it's your dad, dumbass. You know, like that. Again, that doesn't solve, like, what you're talking about with how it presents.
No, because the fundamental thing, like, she had the thing I write about in the review is that when she says, you know, to Odysseus in disguise, did my husband rape? Did he murder?
It's great.
Did he kill
Great.
children? Like she floats the question of what kind of a monster comes back from war, and then offers to introduce and does introduce the question of what kind of a partner welcomes the monster back. What does that mean for both of you? And that, to me, like, when she asked that, I was like, the movie should just end here, because it hit stronger notes than any adaptation of the Odyssey I've seen had. Mm-hmm. But then, like, that moment, again, we can undermine all of this by saying this movie was not for Joel. Right? And he's carrying the Odyssey around in his head.
It's also called The Return, so not the Odyssey.
Amy,
Amy, you got to jump in.
I'm, like, champing at the bit here. Okay, so first of all, I want to go back to Argos for just a hot second.
Don't we all?
I do think like the smell, but also like the voice, right? And like I think by like saying something and being like, I recognize that voice. Like I don't think it undermines the recognition that like it's still a dog. Like what he recognizes, like what is the thing that persists that makes this a recognizable? There is something of the old Odysseus here that his dog can key into. Like I don't think it has to be the smell. And again, I'm not a homerist. I don't, maybe there's some reason it has to be the smell, but I think the idea of like, there's something. And I think, I don't know, like dogs recognize people. And I don't know what specific aspect it is, you know, there's smells and there's sounds and there's all of that stuff. But like, so that didn't bug me as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about dogs in my life. Cause I have a diva dog sitting right next to me here but I kind of like the Laertes thing because what's our policy on, am I allowed to swear?
Yes. Yeah, go for it.
I didn't know. Okay. Like I kind of like the Laertes thing because it raises the issue of like, if you fuck around too long, if you wait, if you're afraid, or like, as he does in the Odyssey, right? If you're doing like shenanigans, like you break your dad's heart. And I think that it throws that into starker relief that like, if like your choices have consequences, like maybe you can reconcile with your son, maybe your wife is going to take you back, it seems, and they're going to have to work on it, but they're going to figure something out. But I think the fact that it doesn't always work out. And I think that's important. So I kind of like that as a different twist, right? It's because I think that there's a little, and this is why I think like also book 24 has to be there because this isn't a story that should have neat resolution. And the fact that book 24 is there makes it very uncomfortable. That lest you think this is like a happily ever after, like make sure you see that it's not.
It makes it real. There's repercussions for how you come home. If you kill everybody, guess what? Wake up and people are going to try to kill you, you know?
Yeah. So
you can't exterminate the entire noble generation and just think that's going to be cool with everybody. Yeah.
Well, and the thing that I've seen a lot of people talking about that they didn't like, and no one here has brought it up and maybe it doesn't bother anyone here, but a lot of people talking about like, this isn't an Odysseus who like, he's not clever, right? He's haunted and he's traumatized. And I think this is part of what I think like, Joel kind of rolled his eyes when Joe was like, it's called The Return. It's not called The Odyssey. The text is speaking about the Odyssey, but
I didn't see that. Thank you for pointing it out.
Yeah, no, I don't want you to miss an eye roll here. Podcasting is famously a visual medium, so this will go great. But like, I think the idea that, it's not the Odyssey. And, you know, there aren't the gods, no one's going to set things right at the end of it. Like not having that kind of Deus Ex Machina moment where Athena fixes it. Like, I think this is a much more post-Vietnam kind of way of thinking about what does it look like to come home? Like it's thinking about trauma, whether we want to call it PTSD per se or not. I know people get real fussy about that, but like it's thinking about the trauma of war. It's thinking about what that does to a person. And, you know, when you tell a story, and I really liked the way it gestured at, like, those are just stories. Like, no one wants to hear a story, right? They kept asking Odysseus to tell stories. And I think I really liked that because I think of this as sort of sure, that's the story that they'll tell about this, but what does it look like for real? It's a haunted man who comes home. I loved it sounds awful. I loved him killing the suitors because it's not, it's not good, right? You see every slow second of the horror of that, and he's kind of disassociating, and I thought that was perfect. And so I guess I think of this movie, and I need to shut up because people have more things. So I just want to I think of this movie as those stories we tell are kind of bullshit. Look at this of like what is war really, and it's not the only response to a story that might glorify war, might glorify heroism. Maybe it doesn't. It undercuts itself a lot. But I thought that's one of the things I like, that I don't think it's trying to be the Odyssey. I think Christopher Nolan's going to do the Odyssey. And I think this is trying to be something different of that whole ethos is bullshit. What does this really look like when someone comes home?
Yeah. And they have nice suitors. There's some suitors that you're that guy was kind of all right, but he gets brutally throat slit.
Well, I'm gonna make a prediction, a wild prediction, and I want all of you to hold me to it. I bet Nolan's Odyssey will piss me off enough that I will say I dig this movie out.
Yes, I think that's right,
my
Joel.
bold
I think so,
proposal.
yeah.
But Colin, to what you just said about the suitors, and I'd like to hear everybody else's perspective about it, but I felt like they half-assed it, right? And here's the thing, like with the suitors, you have two sort of contrary choices, right? And of course, like what anybody does is in between. One, you play them as straight up villains and make it really easy to kill them all. Two, you make them sympathetic. Right. And according to ancient sources, what was different from Homer's Odyssey from other possible versions is he's one of the first to individuate the suitors, to give them backstories, to at least give them the potential of drawing identification. And so one of my frustrations here is, with the exception of the lead suitor Antinous, the rest really seemed like comically bad, like high school bullies type.
You had like kind of a Hitler Youth dude.
Yeah,
the wrestling bully.
And so I'm with Amy. Like, I think the slaughter scene at the end was brilliant. Right. Mm-hmm. Like I went in expecting someone to do a Quentin Tarantino like type of thing. Yeah. And like what they did was like it was brutal. It was visceral.
Deliberate.
It worked really well.
Yes.
But it would have worked really well if I'd given a shit about the suitors. And that's the thing that I'm wondering about. Well, like, is this a flaw in me as usual? Or did you guys see something else?
I will say that's something we're seeing on a second rewatch, actually, because on my second rewatch, I tracked a little bit more about like which suitor was doing what. And it was interesting because Antinous in the poem is the first to die, and they all point at him and be like, he was behind it all. It was his idea. We only followed along. And they do that still in the slaughter scene, but like they're like, it was him, you should shoot him. But he's kind of the last one, and it's Telemachus who finishes him off. But the second to last one was the young suitor who, in the hall when Odysseus first went to the hall and was begging, and they were like, most of them were immediately like throwing food at him, telling him to leave. There's one who's like, no, here's some food. And when they were trying to force Odysseus to fight, he was the one who's like, cut this out. But obviously he doesn't hold much sway or power. And I thought it was really interesting that he's the last one Odysseus kills. And he's not begging for his life. He's got an arrow and he is begging to die. And I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if that makes me more sympathetic to it. I think my critique of that scene, I liked the cold deliberate action. I thought the delivery was, but I also kind of wanted this sense of like what you get from Heracles is like a bloodlust takes over, that you don't know whose side you're on or like who's attacking you and who's not. So I almost wished there would have been another ally that might have been less important. I know that's a little bit, it would have gone off script, that he accidentally kills, but it's someone who's actually on his side and helping him, just to show that like he doesn't actually have control of himself at that point.
No, there's also a brief moment, which I only caught the second time, where the older suitor goes to Penelope and he says basically like all the decent suitors are leaving now and it's only the jackals who are left. And I did not catch that point the first time. I mean, that's asking a lot of an audience to like distinguish between probably a bunch of suitors you haven't seen and these suitors who are left. But it was very like that scene didn't need to happen, where the older suitor went to her and sort of like asked her to, I don't know. I thought that was, I noticed that the second watch.
And he approached her after Telemachus had just left to go find out more information about Odysseus, and Antinous came out being like, oh, wouldn't it be great if he just didn't come back? And that kind of like, that's what the suitor is like. It's like, okay, I'm done with this. This is getting bad. And so that's when he's prompted to leave, which in the poem it's very much framed as they're all fated to die. They like, even the ones that know better, there's a seer amongst them or who knows what's better and has been behaving better because of that, but he's still fated to die in the slaughter. So it is an interesting choice of change they do.
Do we see any of the handmaidens get killed? No. I don't think there was any, because we see them. There are like women around earlier with the suitors.
I was bracing for the killing.
I like when you say, women around. I mean, it was interesting how I felt like the edit took pains to make sure we saw the handmaidens screwing the suitors. Right?
Yeah, and then
and made us see Penelope seeing it. which was interesting.
For sure.
But I was going to ask you guys, like, what does it do for your like evaluation of the movie as an adaptation if they take out those two things, right? And the two things are the mutilation of Melanthius and the hanging of the hand women, because these are, to me, always indications, or they're for like litmus tests for me, for modern readers, of how closely they read the Odyssey and how much humanity they have left in them. If they don't see those two things and think they're screwed up, then they haven't read, or they're weird, right? But they're not in the movie, and I'm just wondering what you guys think of that as the choice that they made.
I was really preparing for them to be there just from the earlier conversation that Penelope and Odysseus have of the, like, did you kill women and children? And he, like, has this reaction of like, well, we're probably thinking yes, like, if you're not answering. And we know that Odysseus has done a lot of terrible things in war, and it seems to have come home with him. So I was really prepared for something really horrible to also happen to women and children in Ithaca, because we've seen
like bloodlust
yes
situation would have
sort of and sort of bringing that war home, because at multiple points he's like, the war, a cup, the war, a table. It's in all parts of his life, and now that he's gotten to that point of, well, this is what I have to do, ? Slaughter all these people, then I was really expecting it to continue. And I don't know. I think it might have been certainly more terrifying and more horrifying, but also would have maybe made the conversation that Penelope and Odysseus have at the end mean a little more. If we can see this like visualization of these horrible things that this person feels is necessary to do now at this point, who they are.
I would add, though, it's also Odysseus gives the command, and it's Telemachus who does it. And it's the same with the death of Astyanax, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Odysseus gives the command and the explanation for why it needs to be done, but his hands are actually clean of it.
Well, and I actually thought that was having Telemachus kill Antinous was sort of a gesture in that, it's like, it's him doing this, whether it's to impress his father or to, for his own particular issues. I thought that was a nice parallel. So.
Yeah.
So respectfully, I disagree with a lot of what's just been said, which is, well, not really a lot. I think that killing Antinous reads as that's justified revenge, right? That is, these men have this coming, and it turns out Antinous seems like a nicer but he's a dick as soon as, he's not really that much better. He just puts on a more genteel face to his not being a good guy. That feels more justified than killing the slave women is unjust, right, as for a modern audience, but also in the text itself, right? It's not like Homer doesn't present this as
horrific,
a horrific, right? And so I was glad, and I don't know how, I was kind of glad that they didn't have the hanging of the slave women, in part because, so I love Juliette Binoche in this. One of the most recent things I saw her in was when she was in Antigone. I guess I don't see a lot of, that was a long time ago, but she really not a huge fan of Juliette Binoche's oeuvre.
And before that, The English Patient.
Yeah. But
once a decade.
Yeah, that's the right amount. I cherish it at that. Once a decade, I savor it. But the thing that I hated about that, it was Van Hoven, Antigone, that he did. Anyway, I didn't think the play worked at all because the Creon in that was so, they played up the misogyny and they played up the sexism in his, and there is absolutely a gendered aspect in Antigone, right? But they played it up to the point that I think often in modern media, being an overt, undeniable, sexist dick is shorthand for this is a bad guy, right? I think we use the female body a lot as a way to advance a plot. It's the sort of women in refrigerators trope, right? And I think if you're not careful with that, and it's a complicated, Odysseus says, kill him with a sword, Telemachus hangs them. There's just a lot there. And I think if you're not careful with it, it's going to read as, we should think that Telemachus is kind of bad in whatever way we want to think about that because of this violence against these women, or Penelope doesn't support women. She's fine with this. And they were probably victimized. And she's been afraid of gendered violence, sexual violence the whole time she's been going through this. And why doesn't she support them? I just think that it is really hard to do that well without obnoxiously like turning to the camera and explaining things. And so like, I was kind of glad they didn't try to do that.
I just want to say that I do not disagree with Amy at all. And I think that the choice that they made is the opposite of the choice they made by having Penelope say, give your father the bow, which is that for modern audiences, seeing the mutilation of a person and seeing women's bodies suffering violence would turn people against Odysseus in a way 100%. That would deprive the movie of the ambiguity it needs. Like, we know he's a bad man, but all of us are hoping that, maybe underneath that chiseled muscle, there's still a heart.
Got ripped.
Veteran.
Speaking of Ray Fiennes' bot, sorry, Christy, unless you
was he wearing a prosthesis?
Finally, we need to know.
Finally, we're getting to the center of the movie.
But actually, speaking of like Ray Fiennes,
the low-hanging fruit,
Joel,
so majestic.
So my wife wanted us to discuss this.
People who have seen this movie, he is swinging pipe in the movie.
Yeah, that was one of the first texts we got
from Christy.
Yeah, not to put you out on blast on that, but it was like I went into this movie knowing I'm going to see full Ray Fiennes.
Yep.
Full Fiennes. But
all right. I'm going back to saying I agree with Amy and I agree with Joel. And Joel, you'd posted something the other day that I almost responded to. You posted the article headline, "Why is the right obsessed with epic poetry?" And like wrong answers only. And I almost responded because I read the Odyssey again. I read like the second half of the Odyssey to prepare for this. And his obsession with finding out which slave women were loyal to him or which had been, sleeping with the suitors. Like it's so there. And I almost like put out the joke. It's like, it's like they're probably obsessed because they can understand Odysseus's anger about feeling entitled to women that are sleeping with other men.
Right. It's because our bodies are their choices.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
And my other thought was like, I don't know, if Ridley Scott was doing this film, those women definitely would have been strung up.
100%.
Yeah, without a doubt.
I think I'm going to offer a contrarian take. Not really, but a more nuanced. This goes back. Actually, this is just something that I talk about because that's a common topic after my Odyssey performances. People want to talk about that aspect of it. And I think that is fascinating. And you already referenced this, Christy. I think like that's kind of a team effort to get those women brutalized like that. That goes all the way from Euryclea to Penelope to Odysseus to Telemachus. And we can talk about Euryclea eventually, but like the fact that she hands the arrow to Telemachus, who then hands it to Odysseus, like that was a brief moment, but I thought that's a, these people are working as a unit here, and that brutality results. It wasn't just Odysseus. He was one link in the chain, but they're the first thing that Penelope says to him in the interview. Like she throws the women under the bus first before even the suitors, and Euryclea is a freaking narc, like she's like clearly, so I thought that there was an aspect of that in the movie that I thought was nuanced and subtle, but really rang true to me as something that I think about with the text, if that makes sense.
Or even just the Euryclea scene, like in the Odyssey, like he holds, I think he holds a knife to her throat, and in this we have that like wrestling scene, right?
Joel wants to talk about this desperately, though. No,
no. Look, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I think it was Amy who said it, but one of you said something just offhand that made me stop for a minute. What I was about to say about the scar.
I hope I was blowing minds over here.
No, but it's like part of the history of receiving the Odyssey is challenging essential notions and themes of the Odyssey.
Yeah,
right. That is crucial. And if we're imagining that one of the strategies of this movie is to undermine the whole notion of narrativity, that we can tell stories to explain things, that they're actually useful, I think that is a good counter to my argument that the scar scene in the movie is completely betrays the whole spirit of the Odyssey, right? And so let me rehearse both arguments quickly. But one, like the whole idea of the scar in the Odyssey is that the scar doesn't need to be explained, but it is a stand-in for a story. It stands in for the poetics of the Odyssey as well, which is that every object, every person, everything you think of is an avenue to another story, which is amazing. But on the other side of that, stories are dangerous and they bring peril, right? And so my one question for you, if we accept whoever said this smart thing, that following Galen Strawson, the movie is against narrativity and against stories dominating us, what does it mean that we as audience members are enthralled to this story?
Good night, folks.
Damn.
I think that's a good question. And I want to, so Amy and I both strongly liked this movie. Lige, where did you fall? You found it boring? You're a little more mid? Okay. It's fair.
So
Like, again,
shitty now.
you have to go see Megalopolis.
No, thank you.
Can I say,
What's
like, I
happening?
actually enjoyed this, and I'm the kind of person who, by and large, like, I have ADHD, and I just, like, I love a just a wild, too much is going on, bright colors kind of shit. Like, this is not at all the type of movie I generally, like, a slow, subtle, muted kind of movie. And, like, I think I actually enjoyed it, like, my film watcher brain and my classics brain actually enjoyed it. But this is, like, Elijah, I'm with you. Like, this is not my kind of like, you guys know. Like,
Yeah.
I have
The Rock
like a
with
hamster
Hercules
wheel.
is my number one favorite classical reception. Like, that's the kind of shit I'm into. And like, it's not like I did actually enjoy. It felt slow, but I felt okay with the slowness of it.
Yeah, I think the hamster wheel in my brain today was, we need to go fast.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's why I think a rewatch is perhaps called for, because there is a time and a place for slow and subtle. And I think maybe today was not my day.
Well, I think there are two movies that have similar arcs and pacing that aren't more than 30 years old. Well, maybe Unforgiven is. But I think both Unforgiven and the movie that people rarely talk about anymore for Tom Hanks, Road to Perdition. And I think what both of them do excellently, that I think probably is what causes me frustration with this film, is their genre pieces that stay in the genre. And I just feel like there's something about the polish of this movie that's off.
What kind of polish, though? You mean the...
Well, let me give you an example. This is stupid, right? But all the external buildings are clearly medieval ruins in Italy. Right. But then they go in and they try to construct like a fake Megaron chamber that has no relationship to the outside. Like, I was like, why even bother? Like, do one thing or the other. Like, what's going on? Like, I think as far as being a period piece, In the Name of the Rose, which we did on this before, was far more effective at sticking to the time, or at least giving an idea that they cared about it. But this is the type of thing that Amy talked about with like archaeologists in the Iliad before, and Christy did too, right? That people are always looking for all the interesting things, objects in the Iliad, and I probably shouldn't be looking for that in the movie.
As someone who is not very good with like archaeology, art history stuff, like I was like, ooh, those like the outsides don't quite feel like those are more recent. But like
it's close in some ways. Like, I get Mycenae vibes, but it's like, but it's not quite right.
And
it's like, I know what they're going for, but
shaking her head as
they
she
didn't
takes
like,
a swing with her eye.
No, it's like
there was a round turret on the edge of that.
I was like,
and it's absolute nerd shit. You guys are such nerds. The average audience member is not going to even clock that.
See, that's why I feel like I have to go into this with like either my classics brain or my movie brain, and I had a really hard time being in one camp or the other, because I really loved thinking about this and watching this and seeing this and all the things that I could point to as a classicist. And I'm just a little gremlin on a hamster wheel as a film watcher.
It is, I will say, like, as someone who is the least concerned with like, oh, what does Bronze Age archaeology, like, that's just not, I'm not.
No, I'm less concerned than you. Trust me.
That, I promise you, the average 99% of the people that watch this movie, even knowing that it's a lot of classicists and classics majors who went to go watch this movie, like, didn't clock that at all. Because it's that, like, I mean, I when I talked to you guys about something before, I think one of you raised the idea, like, there's a thing that just feels like, oh, that's what myth time looks like, right? It's just coded. It's coded as old. And I promise you, most of the audience did not be like, oh, There's a bit of a discrepancy there. Like
So-
they clock
so
as
true.
old Mediterranean shit, and like
Yeah.
that is so. I think that is, with all love to all of you, like that's an absolute nerd criticism that no one else
I
agrees
recognize
with.
that. I recognize it. I embrace it. And I will say I do really dig the atmosphere that I think a couple of you have pointed out. Like the just big booming waves and the sound of the wind.
The cicadas.
I was on Santorini for the first time this summer, and I was like, this is windy. So that like I was like, oh yeah, we're on an island in the Mediterranean. Yeah, it's gonna be really windy.
So Joel, going back to Joel's question and what I was trying to get at with mostly the women really being into this, and some of the other responses I was seeing online, it seemed like women were liking it more, although I was seeing more men enjoy it too. Penelope, I feel like, and I just read it again, Penelope feels so mopey in the Odyssey. Like she's just crying all the time and then going to sleep. And she is clever in some of her ruses, right? Of the loom and coming up with the challenge. But in the Odyssey,
Those are two pretty big ones, though, to be fair.
I know they are big, but like Odysseus is always testing her to like check her loyalty and stuff. And she doesn't really get to do that until the very end with asking about their bed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I go off on a whole rant about the cloak scene where she asks him to prove that he's seen Odysseus, and he describes a very detailed cloak that he was wearing, and that's very, for many people, that's the scene where you can kind of fall on one side of it of like she recognizes him, she doesn't recognize him. But this actually, to bring it back to the point I was trying to get to about Ralph Fiennes, is in the very pared down, like there is no supernatural element. This movie runs into a practical consideration of like, in the Odyssey where there are gods and they're doing magic and stuff like that, like it's easy to hand wave aside that Odysseus can be magically transformed into his beggar persona where nobody except Argus can recognize him. And he can transform in and out of that sort of form, as Athena needs. But then if we're going with like a purely pragmatic, purely practical version, you do run into the actual sort of logical question of like, how does Penelope not physically recognize her husband? Like he hasn't changed all that much. And then that comes back to that scene that we were talking about earlier in the Megaron of like, what kind of person would do X, Y, and Z. And that sort of like, she clearly would know it's him.
Yeah,
just by looking at him.
You could tell she knows it, and like you can tell he's trying to hide. He's trying to stay on the opposite room. It is a darkly lit room. Mm-hmm. Like he is maneuvering in a way not to be recognized, but he fails.
Yeah, it's like an extra thing for the movie too. Like a question the movie needs to answer for the audience is she would just be able to recognize him.
Yeah. And I think to go back to Christy's question, I think that we have two things going on with the depiction. One is there's a grammar of gesture and expected behavior for women in ancient Greek epic that wouldn't translate well today. And there's also the change of form from written or heard to visualize. And so I think, both Penelope and Odysseus in the movie talk a lot less than they do in the book. And I think, in the epic, I think the Penelope here, she does a lot of work when she's not speaking. And I think that makes her so strong, like conflicted and all of that. But the one thing that I wanted was to have her weaving something on the shroud.
Yeah,
because there's this tradition in epic. And so we never hear in the Odyssey what Penelope was going to put on the shroud. It's sort of an undetermined thing about her own agency. And I wanted there to be something, but it was like really like a plain cloth.
I know Amy's next, but did anybody else get the vibes of the wine-colored yarn with a boat going underneath with the shuttle?
Mm-hmm. I love that visualization. Cool. Yeah,
I didn't, but I love that now that.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Amy, go ahead.
No, I love that. Like I did not notice that, but I love that you pointed it out. Okay, I have like three different, it's just several things. I've been trying to keep my mouth shut while other people have been saying stuff, but I have like, okay, one. I love when a movie, and this is especially with film adaptations of plays, like does what film can do that like a play can't do, a text can't do, right? And I think all of that, like the gesture, the looking, like all of the visual stuff, we mentioned like Penelope and Odysseus are talking less, but like on film you can get more in ways that you can't. Like I love when like a film takes advantage of the things that you can do that you couldn't do in a different medium. So like, I really like that. I kind of like, Colin, you talked about like Without the Gods, and I think it kind of hints at that more like allegorical reading of like, sure, Athena can't be transforming him, but like war is transforming, like war has transformed him, right? And that kind of more like, is it Athena grabbing Achilles, or is it, and pulling him back from fighting Agamemnon, or is it like his strategic mind telling him it's bad, that more allegorical reading? Like, I think there, and he does talk like, it's afraid to come back, like, and the idea that someone couldn't recognize him, the only way that works without magical transformations is that what he's gone through has made him fundamentally unrecognizable to a lot of people that used to know him. And to be fair, I mean, most of his like age mates are dead at this point because he got them killed on the way home. But there is still like the only way that works at all is that like war has really done a number on him. Like there's something different that like Eumaeus and his dog are the only ones that really get, like can and maybe Penelope, right? At some point throughout, like she figures this out. But like I think there is like, because that is a much more, without magic, like this idea of like coming home and the process of trying to approach who you used to be and being recognized as the person, like son and father and husband and stuff. Like, I think that is kind of a, like, if we want to, I don't know, rationalize a story like the Odyssey, I think that is kind of a reading that's just available there if we don't think of like Athena as actual, anthropomorphic divinity. The thing I really wanted to talk, because I think it comes up a lot with some of the objections that folks have raised, is, so I think I like the Penelope, but I think that a lot of the Penelope is at the expense of Telemachus. And I think a lot of the places where I don't like Telemachus, some of the places I don't like Telemachus's behavior in the Odyssey are like, he keeps telling his mom to shut up. Like he keeps telling her to do stuff. And I'm like, man, like she comes down, she's sad. And he's like, shut up. I can have people sing any songs they want to. It's not up to you.
He stamps his foot and says, I'm a man.
Yeah,
okay, can I offer Amy, before you go, can I offer a quick defense of that really quick? I promise.
Sure.
Like that is an adolescent using their parent to test their authority and test their limits. That's the way I read
absolutely.
it. Like I like the realism of that. I'm not saying it's not petulant, but I've always thought like, yeah, I remember doing that to my mom, maybe like not to the extent Telemachus does, but I love that you pointed it out because I think that's like a realism sign, like
well,
that's
I think that kind of balance of, right? Because like the relation between them, you see a lot of like where he is in his development, his maturity, right? And we could think about this like without a father there to teach him how to become a man, is he in this kind of arrested development phase? If we have, there's a bunch of different ways to read that, but like he is immature in some ways. And he like, maybe he's learning how to become more, he goes to visit people and they, like however we want to think about this, but it's kind of some version of a coming of age story for Telemachus. And we have book after book after book of Telemachus not being able to kick the suitors out himself. And he has to go learn about his dad and all of these things. And I think the characterization, if we take Joe's reading of like, give the bow to your father, because she doesn't think, like, she can't imagine a world where he is in on this. He recognizes this, he's in on this. And I think that goes to, and like, he's petulant, I think a lot of it has to do with like, how mature do we think he is? Is he a teenager, and is he frustrated that his mom won't let him do stuff and he's capable of more and she won't let him do stuff? Or do we think that he is like a peer to his father in the process of like murdering? And if we think, I mean, I don't know that we should think of like that's what constitutes manhood, but like if being able to kill other men is like a mark of you've come from boy to man, so I think some of those scenes with the like, if she can't imagine, is it that she has no faith in him, or is it that like she's been watching him closely and he's just not impressive? And like, Odysseus says like, man, if I was your dad and I came home and saw like how you had just not done shit for this island while I was gone, like that would suck, wouldn't it? And so I think,
and then
like,
he punches him out.
I'm like, I think I was intrigued by how this visualized Telemachus for me. And I think like a lot of like that Penelope Telemachus relationship is kind of an interesting one. And so I just wanted to hear people's thoughts about the Telemachus, because I think maybe that bow scene is part of characterizing that relationship of like, and he can't, like, I know you can't do it, sweetie. Let your dad take care of it. An angle there, right?
I was going to say, so my reading of that whole scene is, and this is why I like the cleverness of the way they display Penelope's cleverness, is she has been trying to maintain peace this whole time with all of her ruses, right? And here she has come up with a challenge that she knows, because Odysseus is there, she knows he's the only one who can actually accomplish it. If he's willing to fight, if he's willing to show up and do it in this movie, right? And Telemachus, we've already seen, is super angry with his dad, thinks his dad has run away and everything, and he wants to step up in this role. And that line of "give it to your father" is Penelope's way of saying, I know you want to step, I know you think you're ready to handle this, but you're not. And for the sake of peace, because that is what she wants. She wants Odysseus to win this handily and just to be over. And I thought the really interesting change of this scene is like Odysseus knows that if he picks up that arrow, then the war is happening all over again. But he wants to give Penelope's idea a chance, just this chance that maybe this can end peacefully. Maybe her idea will make the suitors acknowledge, oh, we're outmatched and we should just go home now. And Odysseus gives them that chance. He doesn't automatically start firing at them.
I think I mean, I like that reading. I got to sit with that reading for a few minutes.
Yeah, that was good.
But I'm glad that Amy brought up Telemachus, because I do want to hear what you guys have to think about it. But my basic stance, and I want to be mean, but I can't, because I don't know how you do Telemachus in The Return, right? Like in the Odyssey, for people who don't have it in their head, right? Like we don't see Odysseus till book 5, and we spend like 4 books with Telemachus, and we get a lot of time to sit with him being petulant and to understand and to see him grow and have some patience. But if you want to show up in the books where he has no presence, like I feel like that puts a lot of pressure on that actor and the few lines he gets, and for us to interpret those scenes. I'm not quite sure how much better it could have gotten. I'll confess, like I found him uninspiring, but how many people have been inspired by Telemachus?
Well, and Christine, I loved your point about she wants, because she seems legitimately shocked and horrified by the violence that breaks out, right? And like I think, yeah, and he was like, "Is this what you wanted?" Because like Euroclea,
yeah, he asked, "Is this what you wanted?" And she's kind of like, "Obviously not."
Yeah, but like, I mean, he knows, like, if you're giving me the bow and arrow and you're asking me to, like, this is how this ends, but like, and Euroclea is like bloodthirsty, right? Like, we can't tell Penelope because this is the way that you kill them all, and like Odysseus fights that so hard in a way that, like, I think I don't see that in the Odyssey, but I see that really interestingly in this movie. Because he doesn't know if he can turn it off. If he turns it back on, I feel like he doesn't know if he can turn it off. And like Penelope, seeing people be like, oh shit, like I thought maybe this could resolve peacefully. I didn't realize what I was doing here.
Yeah, and like she very seriously is like, the questions she's asking him, because I think she asks is like, why do men go to war? Why do men rape? Isn't their family enough? She doesn't understand because she didn't have to experience it firsthand.
I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead. That was
we kind of like, we talked about her and then we went to Telemachus, but like giving her nuance in the way that they did, Penelope, and sort of inventing a way to describe faithfulness that was complex and what it meant to be faithful in that way, to me, was really inspiring. And I thought it was heavy and real and well thought out, that there's a lot of different ways that she can be faithful in service of trying to keep her son alive, for one, which was very true to like the text to me. And like, that was a really inventive device they came up with to deal with what it meant to be faithful in the wedding bed. I thought, like, at first I thought about that for a while. I was like, well, that's not what I was expecting. Like, that's a change. But then I thought, like, that's also really sophisticated and interesting and real. Like, there's a lot of ways to be faithful for her, that's giving her a little more agency, I think, than one would expect, or a little more control. And you can disagree with that, but I don't know.
I think that's what it is we get to see her exert a certain amount of control to maintain this peace. And she gets told at the end, Euryclea tells her, like, that wasn't peace, honey, which is heartbreaking because she also had just come out and says, like, that's not my son now. Like that, I did all this to save my son. That's not my son. And I don't know, to me, like, I like this film so much because I feel like it did become Penelope's story in the end in a lot of ways, because how does a woman who supposedly has this position of power, and there are a lot of questions of like, why does the wife of the king get to hold so much power? Why does Menelaus have to marry Helen in order to become king of Sparta? Like, there's some interesting historical pattern or like changes over time of like probably lineages, powerful lineages were drawn through the mother's line, because you can't always tell who the father is, but you know who the mom is. But even the later Greeks who are writing myths down, they're like, how do we reconcile this? Why Helen has two brothers? Why does her husband become king? And it's really weird stuff like that. But they played with it in a way of like, she maintained peace the way she could. Maybe she encouraged her handmaidens to sleep with the suitors because the other option is they're forced to. Because Penelope doesn't actually have the power to stop it, but she at least has the opportunity to give them a choice. I'm like, hey, we all know it's going to happen. We're shown off outside of the hall what happens to women who don't willingly go to the suitors. And so I think that's what this is she's maintained peace without a man on the throne for so long. And she's so upset that like at the end, she can't actually pull it off. In this world, you can't actually pull that off.
I do think I loved that the person who betrays her about the weaving, because like I always love how the weaving functions as this, like, the men should know that there's no way it takes that long to weave something, but it's woman's work and they don't think about it and they don't pay it any attention, and it's that kind of like women's bodies and women's work, and like, ew, girl, I don't care about that, and that like allows her to do this forever because it's in such a traditional feminine space that they're like they don't care to know enough. But I like that Antinous like sneaks in or whatever, and we don't have a maid, like a servant woman doing like there isn't that betrayal. And I think, yeah, we had this ambiguity, like she's not mad at the servant women, because in this world, like, it's a bunch of women doing what they have to do to survive. And I think we don't get the kind of vilification of like, oh, well, these are the bad women who slept with the right. And I don't know, like a lot of that's a modern idea about like consent and gender and stuff. But like, I really like that they didn't play this. Like, she got betrayed by one of the slaves who fell in love with the suitor. Like, I liked it more this way. Like, Antinous is clever and kind of a dick. And that's
Yep.
how.
Same.
Yeah.
I agree.
I'm going to attempt a very clumsy transition, but to make it from gender to class. But on that note of like, there is this tension in the Odyssey between Penelope and her slave women, between Odysseus and his crew. And then I wanted to pivot to Eumaeus specifically, who also gets a bit of a workaround in this, where not workaround, it gets changed in this, where in the Odyssey, if memory serves, he's not brought into the fold until late in the game, like basically last minute. And they're like, by the way, we're going ahead with this plan. Whereas he's has much more agency, for lack of a better word. Like he wises up much quicker. He's much more sort of instrumental in the plot. He's kind of this conscience, I guess, for like, he's like a sounding board for Odysseus to like, you know, to talk through things before, like, I think Eumaeus finds out before anybody else in the movie.
Yeah. I mean, my basic take is that all of the enslaved people are presented in a way as to which we don't really think about them being enslaved. I think, you know, the Odyssey romanticizes slavery or justifies it to a certain extent, you know, and I think the movie just didn't have the bandwidth or the desire to deal with that issue, and just sort of left it like, if you didn't know really these people were enslaved, would you think about it in a way that, you know, aligns it with modern slavery? And so for me, Colin, that sort of attenuated any of their characterizations. Like, Eumaeus is just this guy who raises pigs and hangs out. He didn't have, you know, that.
We all have dreams, Joel.
Well, and like what I found fascinating about Eumaeus, going back and reading them in the Odyssey, is like, he is a wonderful demonstration of Xenia, right? He is someone of slave status who is doing Xenia the way it's supposed to be done when all of these suitors who are supposedly of noble status. But then you get Eumaeus's backstory, and it's like, oh, he was from a noble family who was then sold into slavery, or like traded into slavery with pirates, and that's how he ended up on Ithaca, and raised as a swineherd, which goes back to that inherent princely attribute that certain characters have no matter what. And I thought, of course, I really liked that they removed that backstory for this Eumaeus character. And they kind of changed Xenia was still an aspect of this in some ways, but because it's not a concept that's familiar to broader audiences, they couldn't make that the focus of his character either. So he had to be something else. It's like responsibility is king. He
was the way I actually really liked his, so he was, his portrayal in the movie to me kind of lit up a light bulb in what I really liked what I really dug, in the lingo of the podcast about the movie, which is,
we're sticking with dirt metaphors always.
All the time.
Yeah, right.
He ate dirt. He knew the assignment. Ray Fiennes knew the assignment.
Clearly, yes.
Literally.
He's a fan of the pod.
Which is the text that we have, Homer's Odyssey is very sympathetic to the character of Odysseus. It removes responsibility for a lot of the from him and protects him from it. And so, of course, in the text of the Odyssey, Eumaeus is this guy who gushes over his master coming home. And whereas in this version that's removed from a bard telling it, that, Eumaeus is like, not that. He's not gushing over it. He's like all these other characters. He's like we're fucked. Like it doesn't matter that you're here now, and this to me like connects, I think, I'm going to be lukewarm water here, Amy's take and Joel's take, which is, Joel, I know something you're really interested in is holding Odysseus accountable, sort of more accountable for his behavior and his responsibility. And I thought the fact that there was not like a shred of joy in this movie, not a single shred of joy, was a step in that direction. It was what you're talking about. And, Amy's point about here is what war does to societies, and bad leadership in war does to societies specifically. It ruins them, like from the top to the bottom, and everybody suffers. That is a take that, I don't know if it's a take I wanted to see, Joel. Like, I'm more into the identity piece and the sort of meta conversation about a bard and Odysseus and how they relate to one another. But it just seemed like, yeah, I can buy that. That's a take, that works for me, setting aside some of these other things. So I am now lukewarm water and I'm lukewarm tequila, and there it is,
That was kind of something I thought was interesting, going back to Odysseus even telling the story. He's not telling it in the way a bard does, of like this elaborate story that we can imagine. The way I also saw the Bob Dylan movie recently.
Saw it with my parents. Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys see so many more movies than the average person. Like, you are the person who's keeping movies in business in the cinema. Good Lord.
I got a giant gift certificate to go to the Alamo, which is the one that serves drinks and food while you watch movies. So like, I had a reason.
I'm just having an Alamo so much.
And like that movie helped me think about this one, where like we're taking the Odyssey, which I think of as like rock music with all the like accoutrement that goes with it, right? And it's pared it down to folk music, to like just a simple vocal and guitar. And what I like, because my favorite scene is the stringing of the bow. And like I got chills like when he strung it and he pulls it and you just hear the sound. And I'm like, and then like detail. In that you get to hear the music. Like that's why the cicadas and everything is like, we get to hear the music of the environment in which these stories not only were told, but like how they were formed originally, right? Like the experiences people had, and you turn that into musicality. So I was wondering, I guess my question is like, how do you feel about kind of the stripped down bard and the stripped down music of this representation?
It's like a reverse 1965 Dylan concert, right? He goes from electric to folk.
Basically, yeah.
I mean,
Pete Seeger is over the moon. Like
this podcast is supposed to go 5 hours, right?
Yes.
No, I mean, I actually think my one complaint about the movie is that there weren't any bards in it. Like,
I was wondering. Yeah, there's no Phemius.
There's no or Demonicus. Like, but it rang true to sort of the intimacy. I think comes out more in the stripped down version where you're talking about that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I liked it. I thought that was something, the intensity of it, of the simplicity of it, to me sort of was a parallel of that. We're talking about the Bob Dylan movie, right? Not The Return.
Yeah.
No?
We are.
I think Bob Dylan was actually the Odysseus that Joel wanted to see.
Yeah, there wasn't like a bard in the Bob Dylan movie is a thing I noticed.
Don't know what Timothy Chalamet was doing the whole time, but
I would welcome other people's opinions on this, because like I read the Odyssey just as like a fan of Homer, right? This is not my job. And so like maybe between Joe and Joel and others, you may have other opinions on this, but I think of the Odyssey as a story that is kind of, I mean, I know Joel agrees on this one, like a story that's obsessed with stories, right? And it, like, what can stories do, and stories that are true, and stories that feel true, and stories that are false. And like, it just, there's so much about what stories and what narrative can do. And Odysseus is a quintessential storyteller in that both he weaves fantastic tales that accomplish what he wants him to accomplish, but also like he's a consummate liar, right? He's a fiction storyteller if he wants to be. And to my mind, like this movie shuts off the possibility that stories have any solace, like within the world of the movie, right? Like there's no comfort from stories. We don't tell like any stories really. I mean, there's almost no place where there's stories being told. And whenever he's asked, he's like, no stories. But at the same time, this is how I feel about Plato being like, writing is bad, and also I wrote down a lot of things. Like this is a story, right? And for a story to say that stories have no value is kind of a I don't know, just like a paradox of sorts. And I'm just curious how people think about, because to my mind, some of this is I don't know, demystifying is not the right word, but like taking away the idea that that you get in a lot of ancient literature that like, sure, this is terrible, but at least will be the thing of songs, right? At least our suffering will be something people remember forever, that will give something to the future, or will have an eternity, it will have an afterlife. And I'm just really curious about what it means for a version of the Odyssey to say that there is no solace in stories.
Right. We've done a full reversal.
No. Well, it's better than me being like, so Amy, I wrote something about this.
Dude, I've read so much of the stuff you've written about this. Tell me what I've missed.
Listen. No. There's a belatedness. There's a postness to the Odyssey. It's after the heroic world. Gods and men are separated. Everything is going to suck in perpetuity because the next thing you have to read is Hesiod's works. So I actually think the bleakness of it, the anti-narrativity, is about the fact that stories aren't going to save you from reality. And my reading is, again, that Telemachus, the suitors, Odysseus fucked up their lives. They got in trouble because they followed the siren song of a story. And so the end of the Odyssey, the reason I want the book 24 and the complexity, but the reason I'll take the sort of rejection of the story is it's saying that the only way out of that trap is to start to write your own narrative, right? Or to get to a land beyond story. So in that, even though you can't get out of the trap that's saying get rid of story through story form is hypocritical or paradoxical, it's a first step and looking forward. And it's the only way I can make sense of the movie's sort of like soullessness and bleakness is that there's got to be another way.
Well, I think that goes to the closing line too, because she's bathing Odysseus, and I wrote down the closing lines, and it goes back to the scar too. Like there's one scar that has a specific story to drive up a specific memory, but then Penelope touches a new scar she's never seen before. And she's like, there's so much that I do not know. And there's a couple lines between that. And then it goes, he's like, I cannot understand my past. And she goes, your past will be my past and mine yours. Odysseus responds, better to forget. Let's not remember these stories. Let's not know. We will remember, and we will forget together. And then we'll live and we'll grow old, friends again together. And I what I liked about it then, it was the same of when Odysseus was kind of telling how they beat Troy, and someone goes in, it's like, oh yeah, he came up with the Trojan horse. He's like, yes, a wooden horse. It's these stories are out of his hands now, and he doesn't want to remember them, but he's going to be mythologized. The stories need to be known between the two of them so that they can then forget the stories and move past them. And I think there's something really interesting in thinking about it that way too.
Yeah, so this is like a wildly tangential connection here, but there's a poem that I love to teach after I read the Iliad and the Odyssey and whatever else with my students, like the last week of classes. Is a poem. It's called "We Were All Odysseus in Those Days" by Amarat Huey, and it's based it. To summarize, it's a guy who like went to war, and when he comes back and he has a life, and when people ask him about the war, he tells them about the Cyclops and all. He tells a story from the Odyssey, and there's a line I pulled it up here. Like, you see, he's been talking about the war all along, and this idea that the horror, like I think there is a sense that the horror of war is maybe too much, and the story, this kind of tension between like a story can't give you anything, right? What are we going to do? How are we going to make a life in the wake of unbelievable trauma, unbelievable pain, and the idea that like turning them into stories is the only way to process them, right? Like, we can't process the kind of violence and assaults on like just all of the trauma that goes along with an incident like that, but that maybe you can turn them into a story. Like, turning them into a narrative is the only way you can make sense of them, because otherwise it's like, how do you move through a world where violence and pain and all of this stuff is unpredictable and it's surrounding you? And like, well, we turn it into a story where something was gained from that. There's a reason, there's a lesson, there's an outcome.
What I would add, though, is the art of memory is also the art of forgetting. And sometimes creating a story that leaves things out can allow you to live anew. And so what I think is really like clever and smart about Christie bringing up that ending is the Odyssey we know in book 24 does end with an act of forgetting, right? The whole notion that the only way Odysseus' people and Odysseus can stop going to war is if they forget their losses, if they forget the murders. And there's this proposal at the end that we cannot get out of a constant state of violence unless we learn to forget. And so I think the end doesn't, I don't think, maybe I'm making it more determined than it is, but it asks us to think about that balance of forgetting and beginning anew, as opposed to remembering and staying rooted in the past.
And that's what amnesty means, right? Like, the idea of that we have a long history of thinking about how can memory and forgetting, like intentional forgetting, cause healing, which I think, and sorry, I know we're trying to wrap up here, but like, I think a lot about the fact that they go to the island of the Lotus Eaters where you forget. And this idea that like, there's implicit this idea that there's something noble in leaving. Like, he goes and saves them from this. And like, he saves them so that they can go die, right? So they go back into trauma, die. And that remembering everything all the time is like, they would have been happier if he just left them on the island of the Lotus Eaters, right? And like, not that like a complete oblivion is the answer, but that there is this balance to be kept, and that sometimes when you turn it into a story, when you turn it into a really good story, like, things make sense, and the part that don't, you get rid of them because they don't fit in the story that you want it to be about.
Isn't the last line of that poem is "Call me nobody, let me live"? That's the one you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
That's like one of my favorite, like, that's a devastating line. Like,
well, my
there
grandfather was in World War II, and like, every time he was at the landing of Normandy, he was the 101st Airborne, like the Band of Brothers, Screaming Eagles stuff. And every time he would ever talk about World War II, it was like the shenanigans they got up to, right? It was like pranks they were pulling in camp. And like, it wasn't until after he died that I learned, like, I was not a military history person. Like, I learned, like, he was a part of major events in World War II. Never wanted to talk about those, right? Wanted to talk about like ridiculous pranks that he and his buddy John would pull. And I think like this poem just feels that way to me, of like, that's kind of idea of like, how do you're like, we all want the same thing from this world. Call me nobody, let me live. That there's this act of like intentional forgetting that you have to disappear in some way.
Wow. Yeah, that
I
feels
feel like I'm
a
in like
really-
we're in like a sci-fi scenario or like an ethical conundrum. Do you like wipe the memory of the person to like give them a blissful life, or do you like let them remember
The
the
eternal
truth?
sunshine of the
sunshine.
spotless Odysseus.
Yeah.
That's why
Exactly.
Helen puts the drugs in book 3,
Yeah.
right? That's the
Oh,
same
yeah.
thing.
She was right to do so.
She was. That's competing
I will
stories,
say,
you know?
over the years, I have like, when I was younger, yeah, you save them from the lotus. Yeah, you shouldn't be giving people drugs. I'm like, I don't know, man. Over the years, like having seen what like staring at the horror of the world has done to people, like a little strategic lotus is like not
Amy's
so bad.
advocating that we take the blue pill and keep living in the matrix.
I mean, just like a little nibble of the blue pill to help you figure out how you navigate the outside, right? Like, I feel like there's an element like
just one bite of the steak.
Is there something noble about wallowing, like staring into the abyss all the time? And like, I think that's a question that the Odyssey, like, this is one of the things that, like, this is why I'm an Odyssey girly and not an Iliad man. Like, it's because I love that there's so many weird, ambiguous paths that, like, well, like maybe this, but maybe that, right? Like every single book of the Odyssey is like an ethical or philosophical thought experiment that you can like dig into. Like, what do we make, like, well, sure, like the Cyclops is bad because he's eating people, but also like maybe you shouldn't show up at someone's house and like demand presents from them. That's not great. I feel like the Iliad gives me less moments to really grapple with all of those like kinds of questions. And like the Odyssey at every turn is things to grapple with. And so, yeah, I feel like that's one of the things of like, I don't know, maybe you smudge the story a little bit and turn it into a nicer story, because the story as it stands isn't great. But if you smush it around a little bit, you can't see the bad parts. Like, I don't think that's as like, I don't know, cowardly a stance as I did when I was 18 or 19 and I first started digging into classics.
I hear that. Yeah.
All right. I know we've got one of the guests that needs to get going. So Joel, you want to share final thoughts and then give us your plugs for socials and your most recent achievement?
Yeah, I think my mind's been shifted a little. I mean, I didn't hate the movie as much as I wrote about it, but I also think that like this is not to get meta, but I think the thing
you're
we
going to
often
get
miss out on,
you absolutely are.
Yeah,
we can't talk
the
about
thing
the
we always
Odyssey
miss out
without-
on. The thing we always miss out on talking about ancient literature is that people watched it with communities and reflected on together, and that changed it. That change took the individual interpretations that are lonely and brought them together into something that was composite. And that's what we should all do with literature and art. And so I'm grateful to all of you for making it possible. As far as plugging things, I guess my press will get mad if I don't say it. I have a book coming out January 14th called Story Life on Epic Narrative and Living Things. And it's a series of analogies using biology to help us think about where stories come from and what they do in the world. And it's crazier than almost anything I said on this episode.
It's so good. Like, it's so good. I got to see prints of it and like, oh my God, it's fantastic. Highly recommend everybody buy it, read it. It gave me so much to think about. Like, if you're not going to hype it as much as you should, Joel, I will hype it. Like, it's phenomenal.
Send me your Venmo and I'll take care of you.
Amy, final thought?
Yeah, I guess I don't undig
You like this movie less
like,
now.
no, I was gonna say like I'm not gonna say Jill pulled me that. Like, I think I like it differently than I did, like having grappled with some of the stuff that like things I didn't, but like a lot of the things people pointed out are things I didn't notice and they're cool, right? Like, you guys pointed out things I was like, oh, that's another cool thing. And if nothing else, I feel like it made me appreciate more, like, it gave us a lot to talk about. And I love something that gives me a lot to talk about, right? It's the worst academic thing to say, like, it's good to think with, but like it this conversation made me think this is good to think with. So, yeah, I don't know if I have anything to plug. Shoot. I don't know. I'm going to start blogging again. I might have, find me on Blue Sky. It's a Pistone. I'm planning to start blogging again. So I might have thoughts about things. I have lots of ideas that I've been chewing over the last semester when I had no time to write. So that's all I got. I don't know. I don't. Oh no, I will have sometime in 2025. I'll be in a special issue of a journal museum about classics and comics. It's about Cersei and the reception of Cersei in DC Comics as an antagonist who eventually is less of an antagonist to Wonder Woman. I'm really excited about it. So yeah, keep an eye out for that sometime next year. This year.
Awesome.
Yes.
Joe?
Yeah. Final thought, which is something I like to point out to audiences when I perform now, is I think I grew up in a desert of classical reception, essentially, when I had very little to work with when it came to things like this. And, now we're in like a boom time of classical reception, and it's everything from literature to movies to podcasts like this. And it's glorious. Like, we should all be happy. Like, I had, a bad TV version of the Odyssey with Armando Santi, and like that
I was going to say, don't you go bad mouthing Wishbone now.
I was about to say,
no, but I didn't even have that.
I'm in the corner for
Dude,
a
that
moment.
Hermes though is a delight. Like the Hermes in that thing is delightful.
Yeah, right. But my point is, like, these stories exist because they prompted people to feel things and retell them. And like, we're living through a moment in which we're seeing that in real time, that it's not an accident these stories still exist. Like, they perpetuate themselves by causing people to retell them and then either like it or not like it. But as long as you feel something, like, it doesn't really matter, and stories are meant to be like, talk about what the last version got right and then what it got wrong and then retell it. And it's really beautiful to see that happen in real time with this movie. And I'm excited already. We have to wait a year and a half, but like, to do the Christopher Nolan version.
It comes around fast.
Yeah, it does. It does. It does. And like Joel said, like, I thought I was kind of done with the Odyssey thing, but like, now Christopher Nolan is making me think about, like, doing it more than the Iliad thing. So, and then the things to plug are just my musical projects, which are joesodyssey.com and thebluesofachilles.com, which I'm sure will be in the show notes. And I mean, we could do this podcast for probably 15 hours and all of us would still have things to talk about. So I really, really appreciate being invited on to exchange the ideas with everybody. And it's really beautiful. And it's what got me into classics in the first place. So.
Colin and Lige, did you guys have any final thoughts? Anything you didn't get off your chest in the awesome discussion between our very...
I know. I will say I know that I am like always the negative Nancy. I do appreciate that having these conversations with you guys make me slow down, because I think I need a mechanism to make me slow down sometimes. And I do feel like I remember conversations that we've had in the past where we kind of bemoan the lack of diversity in different types of receptions that we didn't have in the past. And so I say I really appreciate that this is something new. This is something that hasn't really been done this way before. We haven't had just a return. We haven't focused on this part of the Odyssey. It hasn't been done this way without, the fantastical elements of gods and magic. And so I think I appreciate that it's something new, that it tried to, tell this story in a very real, trauma-filled way. And that's, giving us a lot more variety to the way that we tell these stories. And so I do really appreciate it from that. And I kind of can't wait to compare it to whatever in the world is coming down the pipeline from Christopher Nolan.
I was thinking in terms of like reception, and like a bit of reception I really like, which is in many ways like the polar opposite, is David Lowery's The Green Knight, which leans into the weirdness of
I loved that.
Arthurian.
It's so weird. Yeah.
Yes. And just gets into all the thorniness. And I think like this is the very unweird Odyssey. Like, it's the most literal sort of version of the Odyssey. It is like bare bones. It is stripped down. It is naked, pun intended.
Blowing in the wind.
Yeah, no, I think that whole scene is a metaphor for the movie of Ray Fiennes just walking out.
Yep.
But like, I'm ready for the surreal Odyssey, right? The like the bizarro, like that just leans into the
experience.
the oddness of so much of what's going on in it.
Sure.
Which is, again, like, that's the movie. That's a different movie. I don't fault this movie for not being that movie, but that's what I'm looking forward to next.
I love when like movies take a chance, right? Like this was
Yeah.
doing something really
That's it.
different. And,
Mhm.
and like
And
they
a decisive chance. Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
like doing something bold.
Which is
like,
why Megalopolis is good and great. No.
I still haven't seen it, but I do want to. But like the idea that like you're doing something, right? It's not just like a retelling, like everyone's wearing
Yeah.
togas and it's you got a cyclops and
Mhm.
whatever. Like it's doing something really bold and different. And like I will always ride for the things that are like do something, like have some conviction, do something interesting.
Make
If
a
it doesn't
choice.
work,
Yeah.
it doesn't work. But like swing for the
Yeah.
fences, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like Ralph Fiennes. Oh, sorry.
I would say just like Penelope, just declare a archery contest and then just throw it all in that coin
Amy,
toss.
I think that's awesome. Like, like you can disagree or agree with the choices, but there were really definitive choices taken. And that's actually maybe what I respect about Reception the most is take a position, let somebody else take the other position and go.
Mm-hmm. And I will just add that unlike Gladiator, which wanted to be so self-referential the entire time and only nailed a Spartacus reference, this one nailed so many Odyssey references in a really
100%.
good way.
Yes.
Like,
The I'm nobody line, like I squealed.
Hold on,
I
though.
squealed.
Me too.
Before that, no one survived the weather. That was near the beginning. No one survived the weather. That was so good.
Yep.
And I think the fact that like when Telemachus came back with information, is like, Mom, he's been hooking up with some girl on an island for the last 9 years. I'm like,
Right.
like, yeah, it even though we don't have the stories within stories, there were little stories there that if you know, you know. And if you don't know, find your classics obsessed friend and they'll tell you. So.
That's true. Yeah.
But it
All
wasn't
right.
like none of those were like Marvel movie, like,
Easter egg for
mugging
Easter
for the
egg's sake.
camera, like
Yes.
overly,
Yeah.
it was like they were subtle and like I didn't even notice that no one survived the storm part. Maybe on a second watch I would have got that, but like I don't think they were obnoxious to anyone who doesn't get those references. Like, but also like there were these like subtle intertexts. Like that's beautiful.
Yep.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you to our guests who are awesome and made for an amazing conversation. We hope to have you all again in the future for sure. Or maybe we'll see you at Camus. I know Amy will be there
I'll
at
be
least,
there.
right? Yay! And then, of course, special thanks to all you listeners. We could not produce episodes like this without your support. That being said, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe if you like what you hear. You can find all our episodes at movieswedig.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about upcoming plans and episode releases, be sure to follow us on social media where you can find us under the handle under some variation of @movieswedig on most platforms. And we'll talk to you all soon again. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.